Okay, it's 3:01. We'll go ahead and get started with introductions, and we can have folks trickle in before Adam's presentation. Welcome to today's presentation, Learning from and Caring for Our Digital Heritage by Adam MacPhàrlain. This presentation is part of a year-long series of programs called Piece Together, Researching, Creating, and Preserving Your Story. This series is made possible because of a gift from the Brant and Jane Hauser family and support from the Jefferson College Foundation. I would like to thank our guest curator and exhibiting artist, Natalie Welch, and her mother, Susie Welch, Jefferson College professor of sociology and social work. They are the ones who introduced us to Adam MacPhàrlain, and they provided the initial inspiration for the inclusion of quilts and their stories in this year-long initiative. So thank you both. Here are a few announcements and meeting tips before I introduce Adam. We still have spots available in our October 27th workshop, Missouri Genealogy Basics from the Missouri State Archives. Check our website for details about that. And I invite you to visit the library, wander around, and look at the quilts and the stories that we have on display. You can come anytime that the library is open, or you can view some of the quilts and their stories online, again at our website. At the end of the presentation, we'll allow you the opportunity to unmute yourself or put a question in chat that Joe will read, and Adam will take questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Adam MacPhàrlain is the curator of clothing and textiles at the Missouri Historical Society. He studied apparel design and merchandising at Eastern Kentucky University and earned his master's in museum studies from the University of Leicester. Prior to working at the Missouri Historical Society, Adam worked for the Cincinnati Art Museum as a curatorial assistant and collections manager for fashion and textiles. How fun. He has presented his research on topics such as French fashion dolls, hand-woven fabrics from Kentucky, and sartorial descriptions in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Adam is currently working on upcoming projects that include revamping permanent galleries and a temporary exhibition on children's clothing. Please join me in welcoming Adam to Jefferson College Library.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that introduction, and I will share my presentation here. Great. So I also want to do a quick shout out to Natalie and her mother, Susie, for suggesting this and coordinating, getting us started here, because it really kind of all started with a quilt top that Natalie had been gifted, and it was, they didn't know any history about it, so they brought it into the Missouri Historical Society where I work to just learn a little bit more about it. And so we kind of walked through what the what the quilt said about the maker, or what we can learn just by looking at the quilt, to kind of get a little bit of that history. So I titled this talk Learning from and Caring for Our Textile Heritage. And this idea comes from the fact that in most of us either have inherited a quilt, a bedspread, an Afghan, or sometimes even clothing from our parents and grandparents and so forth. Or sometimes we find things in antique stores or thrift shops that spark our interest, and so we get them. So this presentation, I'm going to start with how do we identify what we have, and then I'll go from there about how we care for it, and I'll share all the pictures that you'll see in this presentation are pieces that are in our collection at the Missouri Historical Society. And then, so I'll go through identifying and caring for textiles, and then I'll kind of go through some various examples from our collection as well. So I'll just say, because I've not used Google Meets before, so I am at this point only seeing my PowerPoint screen. So if there are any issues, someone will need to unmute themselves and say out loud if there's an issue. But otherwise, I will look forward to hearing from you at the end of the presentation with questions. So without further ado, how do we identify what we have? So the quick and easiest thing is, what do we already know? So if this is something that has been passed down in your family, do you know the story behind it? Is it something that your parents made or your grandparents or an aunt or uncle? If it's someone that's a little bit farther down the line, say it's a grandparent or a great grandparent that may no longer be living, then you want to start asking those people that are still alive about their memories, because that is, I think, something that we tend to uh, forsake that importance when those people are alive. And so I think it's very important to make sure that you're not just asking those questions. And I have highlighted here, write it down. So if you've got a quilt that you know your great grandparents made, your great grandmother made, one, write that down. Two is write down any information that you can get from, say, a living grandparent or parent that may remember um, that maker. So it can be anything from, and I think this is important, is while we're talking about what we can learn from textiles, it's not just what the textile itself says. Record anything that you can about that maker. Record their life history, because that, after a certain point, that oral tradition may die down and you lose things. So include who made it, when they were born and when they died, where they were born or where they lived, and anything that's interesting about that person, what they did for a living, or in a case of someone who made a textile, was that a hobby and a craft project for them? Was it something that they made regularly? Did they were they known for their embroidery skills or their quilting skills? So keep that all in mind if you do know that history. And as I go through some of these slides, I will tell you a quick bit of history about the pieces that you're seeing on the screen from our collection at MHS. So I'll go back real quick. It's kind of hard to see in the background, but there is a textile quilt background behind the title slide, and that one is a quilt made by a woman named Elma Sheldon Lewis of South Iron County, Missouri, around 1930, and it's a patchwork quilt with a star pattern. The quilt that you see here is a much, much more recent one. This one was made in October of 2014 by students at Forest Park Community College. And this was made 1 month after the murder of Michael Brown, that was shot by police in August of 2014. And so a lot of the students at Forest Park Community College are either from North County area, where in Ferguson or nearby, and we're feeling really distraught by the whole situation and about the turmoil in Ferguson and the protests and such. And so they were asked by faculty to create these quilt squares, and they also decorated T-shirts as well. And then a faculty member at Forest Park Community College took the patches and created this quilt. And the whole idea was, it was a way for them to process their feelings, and also this idea of sharing love. And this, so you'll see in some of the close-up here, they were perhaps feeling angry, but this quilt was really about healing and feeling love, and that. So it's a really important story of how we process information. So how do we identify quilts when we don't know the object's history? Whether it's a family piece, but you don't know who made it, or where they got it from, maybe it was purchased by a family member, or, like I said, if you've gone to an antique store or a thrift shop or find something, and you don't know anything about it. The first step is to identify what type of object it is. So, and I will say, and I kind of hinted at this at the beginning, I'm really going to be focusing on flat textiles. So things like quilts, coverlets, baby blankets, Afghans. I'll talk about embroidery and samplers a little bit as well. All of this holds true for clothing items as well. A lot, even in terms of the storage that I'll talk about in a little bit. Um, Making sure that you kind of know what it is. Then you look for things like, are there any tags that are attached? Are there any signatures on it? Um, then you can identify um, any kind of style or pattern. So, and this is, and I'll provide a little bit of information on this as well, as use books, the internet, um, creative Googling can generally help you find, if you have a quilt that has a star pattern on it, if you Google star quilt, you can probably find similar things. And sometimes the pattern or style might tell you a little bit about when it's from. Um, then you identify the materials. So if you are able to, for anyone that does any quilting or whatnot, um, identifying what kind of fiber it is. And that's particularly helpful if you're looking at man-made fibers, so synthetic things like polyester versus natural fibers, which may have the possibility of meaning that it's older. If it's man-made fibers like polyester, that means it's going to be second half of the 20th century or newer. And then identifying if they're solid, printed, embroidered, any kind of technique that's used to create that. And then what is the construction technique? So is it sewn or woven? Is it pieced together or appliqued? Is it hand sewn or machine sewn? So that all of those things can kind of tell you a little bit about, can help you kind of start to deduce when it was made or how it was made. And so the piece here is a coverlet woven by John Eusebius Snyder, who was a German immigrant who came to St. Charles County in a town called Hamburg. And he came here in the 1840s and became a citizen of the US in 1848 and became a coverlet weaver by trade. And he was known for doing what are called jacquard coverlets. So to not go into a lot of technical details, a coverlet is a type of bedspread that is created using what we call an overshot. So that means that if you're doing, you have your warp fibers, which yarns, which are your vertical yarns, and you have your weft, which is the horizontal. And so if they're crisscrossing like that. And so an overshot means that you have your grid of your vertical and horizontal yarns, and then you send an extra uh, horizontal yarn across and create the pattern using that extra yarn. So sorry, that's a little bit technical there for any of you that are not weavers, but that's kind of your basic coverlet. And so generally that's creating very geometric patterns with it. And then when the jacquard loom came into being, that was a mechanical way of creating these patterns. And so you have something like this here, which is a much more organic shape, all these flowers, and you can see things like buildings with fences in them. And so he was known for that. And he also signed and dated his pieces. So at the bottom right-hand corner, you see made by John E. Schneider, Hamburg, St. Charles County, Missouri, 1872. So in that case, that tells us a lot of what we need to know about, we know exactly when it was made, what year it was made, and by who, and where they were located. Most of the time, you're not going to get that lucky. Sometimes you can get a name or a person's initials and a date. So some suggested resources for research. And I will say these books that I've listed here, a lot of these are older books. There are probably some newer ones around as well. These are kind of ones that I just had quickly lying on my shelf. Um, but these are books that kind of can help you identify and help you date and know what the pattern is or anything significant about that. So I'm not going to read these out individually, but they're pretty much go to your local library, and you can search the catalog and see what they have, but also work with librarians to kind of come up with some good resources to help you identify what you've got in hand. And so this one here is a new acquisition to our collection. This, surprisingly, this is our first true granny square Afghan in our collection. And probably every single one of you on here on this meeting have one of these or have seen one of these. They're a pretty ubiquitous part of American culture in the 20th and even into the 21st century. So this particular one was made by a woman named Mary Purdue in the late 60s, in the 60s, early 70s. And it's a type of double crochet that produces these squares that you can kind of manipulate in different ways. And the pattern actually goes back all the way to the 1890s, but really became popular in the 1920s to the present day. Preservation versus conservation versus restoration. So you've got your antique textile and you want to know what to do with it. So there's some subtle differences in these three words, and there's some overlap in it. So I'm going to just briefly touch on this because what we're going to be talking about today is specifically preservation. And that is ensuring that objects are kept safe, including proper storage. So just making sure that you treat what you have well, but you're not necessarily doing anything special to it. You're not changing it in any way. Conservation is a step above that. So that is where you're going to be repairing or stabilizing damaged areas. And that may include painting or patching small areas. When we say conservation in the museum field, that means that anything you do has to be reversible. So if you put a patch on there, you need to be able to take that patch off. If you use glue, and yes, we do use glue sometimes, they are specialty glues, but if you use glue, that glue needs to be able to be taken off without damaging the original textile. Generally speaking, conservation should only be done by a professional conservator, and I'll give a resource on that in a moment. I will say, because most of the time our home textiles are probably not ones that it's going to be worth spending the money on a professional textile conservator. But the one thing I would say is if you are or know someone that is fairly good at hand sewing, there are times when you can get away with doing some light repair work, but just know that you have to be very careful and anything you do can risk damaging the textile, so just be aware of that. And then the final is restoration, which is repairing objects to make them appear new. And that could be completely replacing broken or missing parts, painting large surface areas or covering large surface areas, or making irreversible changes. So using, maybe that you use, maybe not for textiles, but you've got a vase that's broken and you use a more permanent glue to fix it. Maybe it looks great. That is what we call restoration. That is not reversible. You're just putting the pieces back together and making it look like it is one whole again. So be aware of that. And this is a wonderful crazy quilt here that we have in our collection. And I'm going to do a couple of zoom in, and I'll talk a little bit more about crazy quilts in a little bit. This is one that we do not know who the maker of the quilt is. And I'll go more into what a crazy quilt is in later, but here you see scissors and needle and thread and teacup. And then the best part is painted portraits of a dog with an envelope in its mouth and a cat with a yellow ribbon and a yellow yellow, sitting on a yellow pillow. So here's the nitty gritty, and I can be corrected if I'm wrong, but I do believe this is being recorded and will be available. So these slides will be available. I can also share this with Lisa as well to have this presentation made available. So don't feel like you have to be writing everything down furiously. So I'm going to have this slide, and then I'm going to go through the second slide that has similar information. This slide is what we use in the museum field, and this is what we call best practice. So this is our ideal. The next slide will be let's be frank, archival materials can be expensive. What can I do if I don't want to spend $100 or more to store my objects? What are some things you've got around the house or cheaper things to do? So what we use, we store, well, let me first say, what I'm going to talk about here is specifically flat textiles, but I am going to make a quick plug for if you've got clothing items. Clothing items, the ideal is a little bit counterintuitive. If they are fairly sturdy, something like a coat or a suit, then we actually prefer them to be hanging. So we actually use plastic suit or coat hangers. And when I say coat hangers, I mean the kind of broader, fairly wide hangers that are made out of a polyethylene plastic. And then we generally put some kind of padding over that so it's softer. And that way that you're not having to fold it or create any creases in the fabric. For flat textiles, obviously you can't hang those easily. So these are going to go in boxes or rolled. So on the top image there, you see what we call a blue board box. And I put in there, we use the term blue board. Actually, you can get them in gray, you can get them in cream. So they come in different colors, but the standard is blue, and that's just kind of our term for it. And you'll want to look for something that's called uncoated. So if you see a shiny sheen on the box, that's coated, and you don't want that. You want an uncoated matte colored box. And that's called what's shown there is textile. You can find, they're called textile boxes. Or you can do a metal edge box like the one that's on the right in the middle. Generally, those come in deeper boxes, so the lid is the same height as the base. And those are particularly good if you're stacking boxes. They're a little bit sturdier. I tend to prefer the shallow lid blue board boxes, but both are approved. If you're going to roll a textile, we have similar type material generally come in blue color, but they are archival tubes. And then some other supplies you're going to need are some unbleached cotton muslin. You can get that pretty much anywhere in a fabric store or order it online. White silk habitai, which is just a type of plain weave silk, or white nylon or polyester fabric. And then you will likely need some polyester fiberfill or batting. And you can get these archival products. I've listed a few sources there. So our standards are Gaylord, which can be a little on the expensive side, but they pretty much have everything you could ever need. Brodart is actually a library supply company, but they do a lot of these types of projects. The metal edge boxes generally are Hollinger Metal Edge, and then other places like University Products, Test Fabrics, Master Pack, Talus, they're all archival supply places. My general recommendation is use a place that is known for selling archival materials. Places like Michael's and craft stores sometimes sell them. We generally don't trust those, that they are actually archival. It is the same as I don't ever recommend someone taking a wedding dress to a dry cleaners that say they do archival packing. They are generally not trained on museum practice archival handling, and you cannot trust that they are doing it, truly doing it archivally. They may be. I don't want to speak ill of them, but unless you really trust that person, I would trust buying the supplies from a trusted archival supply store. Again, these can be pretty expensive. Oftentimes, an archival box can be about $25 or so for one box. So it's not cheap, but I think it's particularly worth it. And I realized probably should explain what I mean by archival. I take it for granted sometimes that not everyone knows what exactly that means in the context of storage supplies. Is that generally means acid-free and pH balance. So nothing in the material that's there is going to harm the textile. If you use regular gift wrapping tissue paper, that can cause textiles to yellow or decay over time. Pardon me, we'll take a quick drink. So that is what I mean when I say archival is generally products that are listed as acid-free. So that's our ideal, but we all know that that can be expensive, and sometimes that's just not feasible. A lot of those products you do have to order online. Maybe that's just not in the budget or not in. You don't have the time to do that. So, excuse me. What do you do if you don't have all that stuff and don't want to spend the money? You can use regular cardboard boxes. Honestly, I would probably, for most pieces, go with an opaque plastic bit like the one shown. And I say opaque because you do not want clear if you can avoid it. Light is the enemy of textiles. And so anything that you want a solid surface that light won't go through. And if you're going to roll textiles, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, you can use regular tubes, cardboard tubes that you get in, sometimes mailing supply companies or things like that. Tissue, use archival tissue. That is the one thing I'm going to tell you to splurge on no matter what. That is a big help in making sure that everything is good and clean and safe. You can use a bed sheet. I generally prefer the best is a plain white bed sheet, and then you will have washed that. And we generally recommend dye-free and scent-free detergents. So if you use liquid detergent and it's blue, we generally prefer not to use that. And anything that was a scent, because all of that stays with the fabric on and can cause harm over time. And then I know it sounds weird, but aluminum foil is your other supply. And so I put in highlighted here, please, please, please do not use mothballs or cedar chips, and do not store them in a cedar chest or other wood chest. That used to be the old go-to to how to keep your fabrics safe. They are bad. They are bad for your textiles. They do what is called off-gassing. So resins and things in the wood leach out outside of the wood, and you can't see it or smell it, but it's harmful gases that cause textiles to decay. So please do not use those. If you have them, throw them away. So now we're on the storage of your textiles. Just want to make sure I wasn't missing anything there. So what I'm going to go through on this slide is, now that you've got your supplies, how do you take your supplies and do a textile? So here we have a double layer wool lap robe from around 1900, and it was used to cover your lap while driving a sled and it was used by a man named William Morrissey here in the St. Louis region. So I don't really have a good slide to talk about rolled textiles, but I will talk about it right now. That this is a double layered blanket, and so it is the solid or the printed fabric that you see here, and then a solid fabric on the back sewn together around the edges. similar to a quilt, but in this case doesn't have any batting in between it and is loose. The two fabrics are loose in the middle. For anything that is double layered, we do not roll them. And that is because as you're rolling, you can shift the two different fabrics, and so you kind of offset them, and it causes the both layers to get damaged. So you are going to either store them flat or put them in a box. Rolling is your ideal for anything that is a single layer fabric that is fairly flat and sturdy. So a bedspread or coverlet is a really good example of something that you can roll. And the principles for rolling and boxing have some similarities to them. So here's my textile that we're going to be storing, and I'll walk through. So you're going to, I'm actually going to skip the first one. I'll come back to that in a second. But you are going to, because you're going to need to fold this to get it into the box, you're going to need to create what we tend to call sausages or snakes. So in the middle of this image here, you see a kind of the long white tube. So that's in our case here is a piece of silk fabric that's sewn into a tube and stuffed with a roll of batting. Doesn't need to be super thick, maybe about 2 inches in diameter or so. And that is because the enemy of textiles is hard folds. So if I just folded this up, throw it in there, throw it in a box as is, that fold right now is not going to be a big deal, but in 20 years, that fold is going to become a crease. And once it starts becoming a crease, that crease is going to be permanent, and it's not going, you can't iron it out and it come out easily. So these sausages, padded sausages, help to create a soft edge wherever there's a fold. So in this case, this particular lap road, I could fold in thirds to make the width of the box. So what you're seeing here is I laid out a piece of tissue on top of the surface and then folded it over once. And when we do that, that's what's called interleaving. So you're creating a barrier between the textile and itself. And we don't always do that. We generally do that. In this case, that textile has that print on it, so that I'm making sure that that tissue is there in case any of the dyes that are used in that start to bleed, then the textile absorbs that instead of it bleeding onto itself. If you have a solid white fabric or solid fabric, that you don't necessarily need to have that extra layer. So here what you're seeing is I've folded the bottom up a third of the way, and then I've put that sausage there where, and there is a sausage in that fold there. And then I've got the second sausage there, and I will fold that over. So here's now my textile at the bottom folded in thirds, and you can see above the box, and it is lined with tissue paper. So the idea is that the textile only comes in contact with the tissue, not with the box itself, just in case. Even if you're using archival materials, it's good just to have extra barrier. And then if you're using a regular box, and pretty much if you're using a plastic bin as well, that's where the tinfoil comes in, is that becomes your barrier. Because if you're using a regular box that does have acidic glues and things like that in it. So creating a solid barrier that can't, tissue, that glue is going to eventually bleed through the tissue. Tinfoil, it won't. So that's, you will line that box, regular cardboard box, with tinfoil. So here you see my final sausage. In this case, I could fold it in thirds to get it to fit the width of the box, and I'll fold it roughly in half to fit it lengthwise. And the key is you want to fold it as few times as possible. So here's the final product. It is folded in thirds one direction and folded in half the other. And you can see it's pretty bulky. In this case, that lap roll is pretty much the only thing that can fit in the box. In an ideal world, we only have one textile per box, but let's be real, sometimes we have a lot of things we need to store in a small space. So you can put a layer of tissue down and then put another textile on top if you do need to. And then you make sure that there's a top layer on top of that in between the lid and the textile. So there's your finished box, and you put the lid on, and then here's the other kicker that's a little bit different than what you used to be told. You will place it in a cool, dark, and dry place. So the best places in your house are going to be a closet or under a bed. Do not place them in attics, in basements, um, and avoid as much natural light as possible. Even though they're in boxes and you've done it properly, so they're opaque, you can't see through them. You want to just avoid any kind of exposure to light. Um, Temperature also is a big thing. So it doesn't necessarily matter if you've got a closet that's really warm. The only time that can be a problem are things like leather can sometimes do have a problem with too hot or too cold. But you want a consistent temperature, and that's why we suggest something like a closet or a bed. Basements and attics during seasonal changes can fluctuate pretty heavily, and they can also become very damp, and you don't want that. So those is where you're going to be storing them. And suggested resources for preservation and conservation. To learn a little bit more about that is the American Institute for Conservation website. They have a resources page, and it even breaks it down into resources for professionals and resources for the general public. They have some videos and articles you can read. And if you do want to look into hiring a conservator to professionally prepare your textile, they have a link called Find a Professional. I will say right now there are no local textile conservators in the St. Louis region. Unfortunately, we do not have a textile conservator on staff at our museum, so we actually ship ours out to places in Minneapolis and Texas at the moment. So it's you're going to have to probably drive a ways or ship it somewhere for the time being. Hopefully, someone will move into the area and we'll have someone closer by. But unfortunately, right now, that's not an easy option for the St. Louis area. There is a book called Conserving, Preserving, and Restoring Your Heritage. That's a good resource, and as well as a book called The Preservation Management Handbook. A lot of those tend to be a little bit more geared towards professionals, so it probably has a lot of information you don't need, but there is stuff in there. Again, good to go to a library, probably not worth spending the money to buy it. And the textile here that you'll see is another fairly recent acquisition for us. Is a WPA woven blanket that was made in St. Louis during the 1930s or early 40s. And it has a tag on the back that tells us that. So that was a whole down and dirty, quick and run through of that. And like I said, I'll be answering questions at the end. But now I just wanted to go through some of the different types of textiles that you're going to likely be that you'll have, and kind of walk through some of those. So a little bit about the history that we know and what we can learn. So this first textile, this is a patchwork quilt, and patchwork quilts are pretty much what most of us are going to have. That's what we're going to be familiar with, and that's where you've cut fabric squares or shapes out and pieced them together to create various patterns. So you'll create the quilt top, sandwich it with the bottom piece and a layer of batting, and then you'll have quilting stitches all across it that put the two pieces, the top and the bottom, together and create the quilted look that we know. They date back to the earliest days of the country, and this is a fairly nice early example from 1835. If I remember correctly, it is signed and dated, but we have not done research yet, so we don't actually know who Anna Dale is or where she comes from at this point in time. These are just some sections. The quilt was far too large, and you'll see that. I know with the crazy quilt that was earlier, we don't have a good space for photographing large textiles, so sometimes they're photographed at an angle, so you'll have to kind of forgive us for that. But this is some close-ups of some of the details. And part of what we can learn from this textile by looking at it is you get a sense of the that it is older based on the types of fabrics that are used. So in the right image around that border, you can see that kind of sheen to it. It's not quite the same as some of the other fabrics in the stars. And that is a chintz fabric, which means it's a glazed cotton. They've treated it to create that shiny effect. And that was a really popular textile in the 18th and early 19th century. Um, and patchwork quilts often were created with scrap fabrics that you had around the house. You had other projects, dress fabrics or upholstery fabrics that you had already on hand and created that. So you can see, a lot of these probably look like upholstery fabrics to us, but a lot of these probably would have been dress fabrics uh, at the time. And again, either it could have been an old dress that was um, too worn out to use um, to wear anymore, so she cut it up and created this textile. Um, and it has kind of various patterns like stars and pinwheels, which were classic geometric designs that were popular in the 19th century. This quilt here dates from 1864, and it was given as a raffle prize for the Western Sanitary Commission's Mississippi Valley Sanitary Fair that year. And it was providing funds for sick and wounded soldiers, orphans, refugees, etc., in the Trans-Mississippi area during the war. And we actually, in this case, it was won by this was given by the donor's mother was the one that actually won the prize. Unfortunately, I didn't record what year it came into the collection, but this was a fairly early acquisition. And we actually do have a newspaper article that describes the quilt and tells us, I believe it was valued at $125, if I'm remembering that correctly. And clearly here, what you learn about, what you can learn about this quilt, even if you didn't know that history, is the patriotic message with the red, white, and blue colors and stars and stripes. This is what we call an applique quilt. So that means that the white fabric is solid and the top layer and bottom layer have been sewn together. And then all the design you see, instead of being pieced together, it is all those pieces are cut out and then laid onto that white textile and sewn on top of it. So it's one solid white layer. And this was made by Mary Clow, who was the grandmother of the people that donated it. It was made in 1855. And this is a really great one where they provided the donors, the grandchildren of Mary Clow, gave us a really beautiful story about this quilt. They lived in the Ozarks area in Fidelity, Missouri. During the war, their home was burned down. And so Mary saved the quilt and stored it under a fallen tree with some food provisions. And the house was rebuilt. It was burned down a second time. And they fled with the quilt to Texas and then returned eventually to Missouri and passed down through the family. So it just shows you how important these pieces are and how treasured they are. This is another type that's called a double wedding ring, and it was made by Nancy Holbrook of Moberly, Missouri. They were part of the founding families of that town of Moberly. This is a recent acquisition. This is the pattern is called Dresden Plate and made by Bonnie Miller in Cardwell, Missouri, which is in southeastern Missouri. And these were made with scraps of fabric that were purchased at a department store as a bundle of scrap fabrics. The family was very poor. They were sharecroppers. And so they didn't actually have scrap fabrics from dressmaking projects and such. So this is what they could afford to do to create this fabric and to create this textile. And this is an album quilt, and I'll talk a little bit more about album quilts in a second. But this was made in the from the late '80s to early '90s by the Flower Valley Quilters of Florissant, and so a quilting group that made it. Samplers, I'm going to rush through so we have more time for questions and answers. Marking, so samplers are things that were particularly popular in the 18th and 19th century. We don't do that really as much anymore, but they are ways to practice your needlework, and oftentimes involve letters, design, various designs, flowers like this one, made by Elizabeth Ingalls in 1862. It can be drawn work, which is another type of needlework. This one was done by a girl named Alvina von Engelrod in 1840. And there's a little bit of a close-up up so you can see the type of, this is also sometimes called white work, where it's white embroidery on white fabric. Log cabin quilts is another type of pieced quilts that have this stepped pattern here. So these are the one on the left is, you can't see it in this image, but diagonally across it is the word "Feed the Hungry," and it was made in Lexington, Missouri, for a fundraiser for a church bazaar, and it was quilt was bought for the raffle for $206 and presented to Bishop Enoch Mather Marvin, who was the first Methodist bishop in Missouri, or from Missouri. And then the other one was made in a convent in Missouri called St. Joseph in 1896. Embroidered in album quilts. This is a baby blanket that has embroidered nursery rhymes. So you have Humpty Dumpty there and the Cat and the Fiddle. And it was made for Nancy Barthold when she was born in 1923. This is what I'm still doing research on. This was actually put together by a young boy in 1912, and we tend to think of, and it was traditionally a woman or girl's craft historically. The only information that we have about this is that the patches came with purchases, and that was the only wording we have. My guess is it was some kind of kit that was kind of punch card embroidery of the presidents and buildings and such, and that he would have embroidered from a pattern and then created the quilt from. Still trying to do research on that particular example. This is a quilt. So an album quilt is one where multiple people are combining. This was made in 1983 by McDonnell Douglas, the wives of John McDonnell Douglas aeronautics employees who were stationed in Saudi Arabia. So they created different patches and combined them and then gifted it to one of the wives when they left. Afghan and blankets, so crocheted blankets and Afghans. This one made by, sorry, I'm finding my notes here. Made by Marjorie Allen Austin during the 1930s. She was a stay-at-home mother and began doing a lot of crafts and crocheting, and lived in St. Louis. You might come across this, or you might buy it. Is things that are created specifically for art. So this is an art piece by a woman named Edna Patterson Petty, who does fiber art. Sometimes those terms, fiber and textile art, can be used interchangeably, but art pieces using fabric and yarn. So this one on the back, she's titled it Decisions, signed it, and dated it 1992. Yeah, I'm just realizing that I put 93 there on the label, but it was made in 92. And she's actually even put a copyright symbol on there. So that really is a very different type of art. Generally speaking, if you have this, you're probably going to have it displayed versus storing it. The key there is if you want to display it, that's fine. Put it in as dark of a room as you can with as little natural light as possible. And if it is in a room with natural light, do not put it where sunlight coming in directly through a window hits it. It will fade over time and very quickly. And the last one here is Crazy Quilts, which are my favorite. This one is made in 1886 by Margaret Eleanor Christopher, who is from Girard, Illinois, and lived in East St. Louis for a while. And crazy quilts were really popular in the last quarter of the 19th century in particular. And similar to patchwork quilts, they tend to be fabrics that you've collected over time. And they get the name because they are in a random assortment, and they often include embroidery and any kind of pattern and type of fabric you can find. So this one has a portrait of a woman. I've not done research, so I don't know if that is Margaret Christopher or if that's another woman there. This adorable applique of a girl and her kitten, and things like spiders and spider webs. And this is the piece de resistance that I'm going to end with. I've been doing more research. This was a quilt made in 1884 by a woman named Carrie Carson. And it was made for a raffle for a hospital fundraiser. And I don't have a picture of it, but the back of it is actually just as equally interesting because it's embroidered with the last name Nielsen. And so who was Nielsen? I had to look that up. And so it turns out that it is stage actress Adelaide Nielsen. She was a British actress who had traveled through St. Louis in 1879 and 1880. And soon after, I think later in 1880, she died unexpectedly at the age of 32. And presumably Carrie or maybe her parents purchased a dress worn by Adelaide Nielsen in an auction in London, and then Carrie deconstructed that dress and created the backing of the quilt. Some of the interesting things on this quilt include an 1882 souvenir ribbon from the Veiled Prophet. If you know your Veiled Prophet history, their first ball was in 1878. So this is only 4 years after the first one. It includes things like this hand-painted winter scene, playing cards. I didn't do a close-up of it, but it's got a little embroidered demon. Not sure what the story behind that. You can kind of still see it in the center are two gold phoenixes, which is Chinese fabric. There's some Japanese fabric there as well. And then the thing that I've seen thousands upon thousands of quilts in my 15 years in the museum field, and I've never seen anything like this before. Taxidermied chipmunks. And I should say a taxidermied chipmunk because that is one chipmunk that has been split in half and stuffed and put on. We do not know why, but there you go. So I ran a little bit longer than I had planned. Here's just a quick, this is an article describing the quilt going on display the week before the raffle. That's where I found that information about Adelaide Nielsen. So doing some research, this was found on newspapers.com. It's a searchable archive. A lot of libraries have subscriptions to it, but it's a pretty affordable subscription. Has a lot of Missouri newspapers as well. The funny thing too is also this randomly calls them squirrels, but they're definitely chipmunks. So sorry, I ran a little bit longer than I planned to, but we still have time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing and we'll open it up for questions, open up. So if you have any, you can put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself. Okay, Lisa.
Adam, I'm curious about how you became interested in being a fabric and clothing and costume curator.
Yeah, absolutely. My undergraduate degree is in fashion design and had every intention of going in, becoming a fashion designer. And during my undergrad years, I interned in New York and at a fashion company, and I interned at a museum. And I quickly learned that the fashion world is about one of the least creative fields out there. You're never going to become a big name designer. You're going to work for a company where you're pretty much copying, every brand copies off another brand. So I was pretty disenchanted with that world. So I went back to my two intern bosses, my fashion boss and my museum boss, said, "What do I do?" So the fashion boss said, "Look at a master's program in costume design for theater, because that's an area that you can use that skill and be very creative." And then my museum boss said, "Look at a degree in museum studies." So I applied to one program each, and I got into both, but I got to the museum program first. So it was a whirlwind thing. So if you've never heard of University of Leicester, it's in Leicester, England. And I had to work backwards on this. I applied in August, was accepted in September, and was in England in October. It was a whirlwind experience, but did this program, museum studies program. Um, and so I basically took that idea of fashion and did history of fashion with that. And the other quick thing I'll add with that is that also in my undergrad, most design programs require a history of fashion course. And the first day of class, the professor is going over the syllabus and going over the major project that was going to be due at the end of the year. And she said, "Oh, by the way, I am going to be installing an exhibit of historic fashion in a couple weeks. Um, if you want, you can sign up to help install that exhibit, and that counts as your project." So me being I think I was 18 at the time, and me being an 18-year-old said, "Of course I'll install that instead of doing a major writing project." And that essentially is what really changed my life, because I was working with dresses that were up to 200 years old and putting them on mannequins and learning how to do that properly. And that's what really led me to understand that I could do that as a career.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I would like to hear more about this taxidermy quilt. I'm a taxidermy collector.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just any.
Well,
yeah.
I'm still doing research on it. I doubt we'll ever know why. As far as I'm aware, we don't have any kind of archival record of that family, of any documentation. I've never seen anything like it. I didn't do a close up. There actually is another taxidermy on it. There are some similar where it's split in half bird. It's best I can tell. It's definitely not the whole bird. I think it's the body and the head, but it does have all the feathers attached and glass eyes and such. But and they are somewhat three dimensional as well. So they really did stuff inside of it and so on. And like the chipmunk has its feet and everything. So it's proper taxidermy. But yeah, I've not yet found any documentation of um, anyone else doing that or why. Um, the disappointing thing that I'm still trying to find out with that is the story that came with it regarding the raffle. It was the the maker's niece is the one that donated it in the 1940s. and supposedly a nun won the raffle and then returned it. And then I know, and I'm seeing laughing, and yeah, I think there's a more plausible explanation than what we assume, which is that it has a dead chipmunk on it. But then, so it's given back to the maker, who then gifted it to her brother when he got married in 1888. So one is, my theory is that the nun worked, it was a Catholic hospital, and my guess is she was either worked at the hospital or was associated with the hospital, bid on the raffle for the sake of supporting the hospital, and returned it for that reason, that she didn't need it. It was just to financially support the institution. But when there was no information about what the raffle was, it did say what the hospital, which hospital it was, or what, and it didn't say what year it was. So I, through newspapers.com, did that research, tracked it down, and it was a week-long event. So the raffle was just part of the event. And it was the culmination of a week of festivities. And the newspaper that Friday says, it's been a great success. The raffle went really well. Tomorrow we'll tell you who the winners were. And they didn't. I went through the next 3 days after, and they never said who the winners were. So my next goal, I don't think we have anything in our archives at the Missouri Historical Society, but I'm going to go through some other archives and see if I can find any brochures or other things to confirm if the nun really did win the raffle. It's a nice story.
Yeah. Oh wow, sorry, that was terrible. Someone asked, "What's the oldest piece you've worked on?"
So I will say, in our collection at MHS, our clothing and textiles go back to kind of around the time St. Louis was founded, so around the late 1700s. So we actually have the second day wedding ensembles of the Chouteaus from 1786. So if you've been to the History Museum, you'll know that there's reproductions of those in the galleries. The originals are in storage. So I've worked with those. In terms of just in my profession, I've worked with ancient textiles that are several thousand years old. So not frequently, but I have gotten to do that, and it's a really fun treat. Right. Well, thank you guys for letting me be a part of this. And if you do have any questions, I guess you can send them to Lisa, and Lisa can forward them on to me. But I'm glad, I wish we could have done this in person, but I'm glad we were able to make this work virtually.